So, good morning, everyone. My name's Alan, and I'm going to be speaking about Ghostbusting User Stories, which is of a bit of a strange title. But all I've learnt today is from a journey. 15 years ago, I started off as a developer, and I've now progressed. I'm now running my own company. I'm now the product owner. And a lot of the skills I've learned and applied in here have been to solve real problems that we faced running a company that's developing a product. So what do I mean by Ghostbusting user stories? So every user story has ghosts in it. These ghosts are actual real users that you never recognized in the original user story, but when you shipped to production, a few weeks later, they all come up and they start screaming at you. You get these ghostly screams. It's not working for me. Why can't it do this? And it's actually a fundamental problem with user stories, or certainly how we've been applying them for the last few years. So what I'm going to be talking about is how we can identify these users, how we can get rid of these ghosts. So for an example of a ghost, I've got some mobile device usage stats. So we can see Android and iPhone are the dominant mobile devices that are software supporting. But if we're an internal team, we could look at this and say, hey, perhaps when we're doing our testing, we only support Android or iOS. You know, the risk of other devices is pretty low. It doesn't really matter to our users. But we're missing some context here. It could be that we're building a reporting feature, and it's producing financial reports. And the only person using BlackBerry is the CEO, and he's the person who wants to use that feature. So it might be the rest of the users don't care about BlackBerries and don't use them, but the most important user to us for this user story is. We can't see this from normal statistics or other analysis techniques. This is an example of a ghost. You certainly don't want the CEO coming along and howling at you. Certainly my staff don't like it when I do that, but hopefully I don't do it too often. So I'm not afraid of ghosts. I'm certainly not, and I hope you're not. You're all here. So how are we going to get rid of them? Now, it's really, really simple. It's a really simple formula. Find all the users and understand them. So you can all leave now, you know, I'm done. But obviously it's not as simple as that. So what I'm going to be talking about is how we can identify these missing users, and in particular, how can we understand them? And that's the key point, understanding them. So every ghost, it's energy, it's somebody's soul before they move into the afterlife. So there must be a body somewhere. And these bodies are buried in the user story. So we've got to uncover them. We've actually got to reanimate them or stop them getting buried in the first place. So there's several ways we can do this, but first of all, we need to look at how we're doing user stories. So user stories are a placeholder for conversation, or that's what they're meant to be. But what everybody does is quite often follow this particular template. As a particular actor, I want a particular feature so that I get a particular benefit. Now, a lot of people don't have the discussion, or if they do, it's all around this template. The first thing you can notice here is only ever one actor mentioned. But even in a very, very trivial user story, like checking into a hotel, there's two actors in there at least. You've got the guest checking in, but then you've got the receptionist checking in. Just in this simple user story template, we've already limited ourselves to one user. We've gone and buried the guest, or we've gone and buried the receptionist. They're now going to be a ghost that's going to haunt us later on. And these ghosts are really important. If you're developing a product for external use, it impacts the user experience. User experience costs you money. I know for ourselves, by improving our user experience, we've doubled our evaluator conversion rate. That's a lot of money to us as a company. And that's just by focusing on user experience. But even in an internal application, that experience builds trust. It also provides value to your company. But even if we start applying something like behavior-driven development, specification by example to user stories, flesh out the details, we still bury users. So this is an example scenario to go along with the check-in user story. And the most important bit to look at is the when statement, when the guest checks in. Okay, I've got my one actor, but I've still gone and buried the receptionist. So we've got the problem. How can we uncover these users? So the first thing is, I don't actually like the as a template. I think it restricts us. If we can actually just write a short paragraph, it just gives us that freedom. I know it was a good idea to have a template to help us get going, but if it's burying users, we should avoid it. I do have other issues with the template, but I'm not going to go into that. But the trick is, when you're having a discussion with someone, or even writing down user story, or even writing scenarios, you can use the tone of voice, or your voice, and how you write it down to actually identify people. I know it's a simple language trick. I'm actually dyslexic, so I actually hated English at school, and I'm now sort of looking at grammar and voice and language to actually solve user stories. So this is all really strange for me, and how I've discovered all this is actually speaking to journalists. So active voice and passive voice are just two different styles. And journalists from the US and the UK both use different styles. But and in US journalism, they use an active voice. Now, I'm just going to show you the difference. So the passive voice will put the action before the actor. So the verb goes before the actor. This has a consequence. It quite often means you can write a sentence where you don't mention the actor. The actor is completely implied in the sentence. That's how they get buried. That's how it's buried in the user story. That's how it's buried in the scenario. So the active voice is where a style where we just put the actor before the action. We just reword our sentence, and we have to deliberately put the actor in to support that style of writing. We're forced to. We have no choice in it. The sentence wouldn't make sense. So the top one is the passive sentence. So we've got the buried receptionist again. I do feel sorry for this receptionist. But the second one is the active version. The receptionist checks in the guest. So we've got our actor first, then the action. So the verb's coming last. It is possible to get the actor in on a passive statement, but you have to put some clunky language in there. So the guest was checked in by the receptionist. You have to add this on to the end. It's rather clunky. And as a style of writing, you're not forced to do that, where the second one you are. So it's a really simple language trick, which when you're having a conversation with somebody is really hard to actually do, and you have to be really disciplined. But when you're writing down and taking notes, you can look at your notes and hang on, is this active or passive? And just rewrite it, and then you start asking questions. Who is really the actor? So we've sort of covered the first bit. I've discussed a few ways that we could actually identify these users. Certainly the template is a bad way, I believe, in user stories. Just changing our tone of voice. It's a really simple trick. But I think the key point is understanding the users. And I think we've made a few mistakes over the years as an industry. So if we go back to the template, we have as a actor. And what a lot of people have advised, and I know I'm going back to Mike Cohen's book, User Stories Applied. Certainly when I first came across user stories, I was reading that book back in the early 2000s, or was it mid-2000s? So It is quite old, so I know Mike has changed his position on certain aspects of it, but a lot of people end up adding a persona as the actor. Now, I believe this is a fundamental mistake. Now, personas can be useful. If anybody's at Michael's talk beforehand on accessibility, using personas in that context was really useful. But you have to choose when to use personas. So, what is a persona? Persona is you collect data and you group users together by their data. You do research, you give them a memorable name, you give them a photo, you write a description, you can put it as a poster on your wall about your users. And within a team, you can use these personas to actually start discussing people. So they are particularly data-driven. To construct a good persona, you need to actually interview customers, you need to run surveys, and you need to analyze this data. Now, personas come from marketing. They're also used in user experience. But marketing developed it 20 years ago because they couldn't get lots of data. Now we're in the internet age, we can get lots of data. So I've actually created 3 dummy personas, really, really simple ones, cut down. But normally, on our office wall, we'll have a poster with each persona, and we can discuss them. And they get some key information that you wouldn't normally have. So Leanne here is always traveling and connecting remotely. So she has a particular different set of needs to some of the other personas. Certainly Jane works in the London office. But also personas, we can collect more important information. Like earlier I was talking about the mobile stats, but we can actually look at what different persona types, what devices they use. So what mobile do they use? What laptop do they use? What's their operating system? We can understand their environment, the sort of the environmental conditions of the user. But this information doesn't tell us how the user's conducting their job. So to sort of demonstrate personas, I'm going to create a European testing persona. So attendees of European testing conferences. And I sent my marketing person, sorry, we're a small team, and he got me 3 stats. So I want everybody to stand up. And I want you to sit, and the first stat is that 47% of European test conference attendees are test managers. So if you're not a test manager, sit down. Okay. That stat might be on. That's interesting. Okay, so the next one is gender. Unfortunately, 78% are male. So if you're female, I'm afraid you're going to have to sit down. Really bad statistic. And the country of origin, the largest country of origin for attendees, is Britain. So if you're not British, sit down. So how many people we got standing? Just 2. So I've taken 3 statistics, just like you meant to do with personas. I've applied them, and we've got 2 people out of this whole room that match our persona. So personas aren't perfect. You have to construct them carefully. Particularly, you end up with Frankenstein users. Because the other part of using personas is you're meant to come up with a memorable name. And in marketing, you're actually encouraged to use stereotypes. We know stereotypes imply bias. In particular, in a lot of personas, I see gender stereotypes and bias. By using data incorrectly or applying biases or stereotypes, you'll actually end up with a Frankenstein persona, which actually is no use at all. Michael's context earlier today was in accessibility. If you put all the disabilities into one persona, you would end up with a Frankenstein persona. You have to be very careful how you construct them so they're useful. So We still use personas, we're just very careful with them, but we've done something else with them. The reason we have to add something else is that the role in the user story, there's meant to be a benefit at the end of the user story. If you're dealing with a persona, you're not dealing with a person's real job. You've probably amalgamated the product manager, the dev lead, marketing, and HR all into one persona. You have no understanding from that Frankenstein persona, of what job they're trying to do. So you should never use a persona in a role. That's my golden rule in my team. Never use a persona in a role. So what we need to do instead is separate the job part from the persona part. So we should actually define roles. And it could be roles if you're an external product, sort of different user roles. Internally, it could be different employee roles. So again, it's going to require surveys, research. But there's an interesting bit here. You can actually use people's job specs if it's an internal project. Use job specifications, job descriptions to actually define these roles. Because these roles are going to have people's objectives, their responsibilities, the jobs they need to do every day. And that links to the benefit part of our user story. They need that benefit. Their job requires them that benefit. It doesn't matter if they use a MacBook. That doesn't affect their benefit. It'll affect what tools, what environment they use to get that benefit, but it does not affect the job. Now, there's also an interesting interview technique coming through, jobs to be done. You don't get marketing to design your product any longer, because they use personas. They're going to have all these Frankenstein personas there. You're never going to understand the real job, the real need for the product. What you need to do is find out the real jobs that people want to be done. I do recommend Googling that. There's some really good interview techniques. There's a great podcast on it. And certainly from my point of view as a product owner, it's really useful for understanding what people want. But the other thing with roles is we can actually tie them back to the personas. Certain jobs will have certain personality traits, which will generally map to certain personas. So you can actually identify which personas are likely to be doing these jobs. Now, with personas, you normally develop about 4 to 6 of them. With roles, it's literally going to be as many roles in a system, and actually discovering them can be tricky. But the mapping, it can be useful, but don't get caught out into stereotypes if you map roles with personas. And we are going to be using them together later, so it's just a handy trick. Now, discovering roles. It can be quite obvious that we've got a visitor for a website. If we want to on a hotel booking system, they're going to visit the website, they're going to do a booking. But we can actually dig deeper and get more details. And we can do this by decorating that role. We can decorate it with an adjective. We can add a description to that role and give us more information. So on a really simple basis, we can take a visitor, add known visitor in front of it, and actually ask, what is different about this visitor? If they're known to us already, perhaps we've got their previous search history. Perhaps this visitor's a regular user and actually has different jobs to be executed. They're trying different tasks. We could perhaps have a best deal visitor. There's somebody who goes around all the hotel websites trying to find the best deal in an area. They've got a different jobs. They've got different needs to other visitors. They just want the cheapest price. They want to be able to search and get a price quickly for a booking. So just by decorating these roles, we can actually start to become sort of investigative journalists and actually uncover additional information. And it's just a simple trick, again, with language, to start the brain thinking and processing. You know, we want to bust these ghosts. We need to find these real people that we've buried in our user stories. We can actually take it a bit further. And it probably hasn't come out very well, but this is actually a hierarchy with our visitor at the top here, and there's inheritance lines going across. So we've got a booked guest, which inherits all the attributes, all the jobs of a visitor. A loyalty club member inherits from visitor, same with known visitor. But then the silver, bronze, and gold club members all inherit from a loyalty club. You can have this on a poster on your team wall to actually get an understanding about the different people who use your software. Sorry, the different jobs, the different roles involved in the software. So we've identified our role, but it's worth noting that one role, say the product marketing manager, might want to access a financial report, but who else wants to access the report? There's always going to be more roles. It could be the CFO wants to access the report. You've got to actually understand who's accessing, what other roles want the same functionality. And it comes back to the template is limiting us to one role. So if anybody wants to sort of discuss why the template's bad afterwards, I'm happy to do that. Because there's other parts of it I don't particularly like, and I think the jobs to be done community is going in the right direction, certainly from a product manager's point of view. Now, we've created our personas, and we've created our roles, and they're useful on their own, but what you can do, if you've got them on the wall and the team knows who everyone is, but as an aid, you can just actually create cards. Just create miniature versions of them. So it's just cut down versions of the posters of the cards. You can have a pack, you can hand it to every member of staff, and when you're actually discussing a user story, you can pick them up and get reminders. But more importantly, you can combine them. So we've got Mia, and we've got the system administrator role. I've just picked these two up randomly. We know a lot of information about Mia, her persona. We know a lot about this job. I can look at them. I can combine them when I come in to do my testing. I get a lot of information just by combining them. But if I've got lots of different personas, I can just swap them around. I get lots of information just from this combination and iterating over the different jobs for a user story and the different personas who could be doing that job. By the way, these are persona cards from Atlassian they use internally there. I managed to pick some up off one of the developers there. In my office, we just use an index card. You know, we're the sort of the low-tech model for that. But the reason you want to do this combination is when you come to exploratory testing. If anybody's read Explore It by Elizabeth Hendrickson, she's got a chapter on sort of varying. She's got a section on varying your test charters and your test sessions. And she mentions personas, but only personas for doing that. I think we can take this combination and come up with lots of ideas. In particular, to use the persona and the role, you can role play your test sessions. If you've got the card and you know a lot of information about someone, you can role play that person. And it just makes your testing session experience that little bit different. You just have to take yourself out of that one frame of mind and put it into another. It's almost like we need to take acting classes. But Michael had a good point in the session beforehand. Sometimes you actually need real people to do it. You can create these personas, you can create these jobs, and you can get an approximation, but until you actually have real people doing it, there's still going to be the odd ghost that's going to get out there. So let's look at the Leanne persona from earlier. She's always traveling and connecting remotely. Her job is the CFO of a huge hotel chain, and because she's visiting different countries, she's accessing remotely. Knowing that she accesses remotely gives us different ideas for our test charters, different ideas, different risks, different things to consider. Could be a good one is security. Perhaps we've got a VPN between our system. She's going to need access. About performance, if she's connecting remotely, hotel Wi-Fi is terrible. I recommend anybody test their application on hotel Wi-Fi. You really do find bugs. So by looking at her persona, you can actually get additional ideas. She's also really impatient. She doesn't like the software looking like it hangs. She'll want a spinner. We can actually get different ideas for our test charters and our sessions just by looking at it. We can also select what device we want to test with. Say, if we're testing as Leanne, we can use the MacBook Pro. We know what operating system she uses. We know what mobile phone. We can find out, does she need to access the reports on her mobile phone? Perhaps that's the best way abroad. So just by looking at the persona and the jobs from the role, we can actually come up with lots of ideas for our test sessions. So we actually have a question coming up. I've talked about we're doing this in exploratory testing, but with the whole sort of shift left movement, shouldn't we actually be getting the product owner to do this? Now, sometimes I've now got a lot of sympathy for the product owner, now having taken that role. Quite often, there's fewer product owners on a team than there are testers. So it can be difficult to get the product owner to work on this. In the ideal world, they would, but it should be part of the three amigos. But what we can do, if we can't get the product owner involved, is when we're working on user stories, and this is an idea I got off Dan Ashby, is actually when we get a user story, and we're going to be testing it later on, and the developer's starting work, actually upfront do a mind map for my test charters. So I've stole it off him about 6 months ago. If I actually do this up front, I can identify lots of issues, and I'll actually show my mind map to my developers. Because they should know about all these ghosts. Otherwise, us as testers, we're just going to be catching it at the end. So I really do recommend doing this up front if you can. If not, at least do a mind map it up front and work and show it to the developers, show them the risks. They'll appreciate it. So there's lots of ways we can go about this. So it's about preventing these ghosts, and if we can, and if we can improve the communication, that's a great way of doing it. So my simple formula for ghost busting is to find all the users. We can do that by throwing away our template for user stories, just too limiting, and we can start to look at what jobs people do. We also want to look at how they're using things. We also want to understand their environment they're using, but their job in particular. So, to find users, I think anybody who interacts with a user story, who gains any value in a user story, should be mentioned. That's what I'm trying to do with that active voice, is just get that information. Start asking questions about it. So in my simple hotel check-in example, the receptionist was never mentioned. They've got a benefit, they've got value, they interact with the system. They should have been in the user story. There could be a management function that's required in the user story. Perhaps the kitchen needs to be notified there's an extra guest checked in, and for breakfast the next morning they need to provide more food. You've got potential other users there that are hidden. Anybody who's going to be involved, just write them down in the user story or capture them in the discussion. Write them in your BDD scenarios. But actually just get them down there, so at least you can have a conversation about them. Create separate personas and roles. Keep them separate. Don't create a Frankenstein persona. Be really, really careful with how you create and use statistics. Personas are meant to be created out of statistics, but as the example showed earlier, you can get really unrepresentative personas. Look at the job roles involved, or the user roles. What are those objectives of those people? What are they trying to achieve using this software? It just gives you a different perspective. Just use the personas as the environment for your testing and ideas. Use the roles to look at the functionality side. And that comes back down to user experience. And then, if you're doing exploratory testing, combine them. Just use something simple like these cards. You can just shuffle through your personas and match them up. Does this persona fit with this job? It's really simple. You could even start playing card games with your colleagues and work out who's going to cover what. We haven't turned it into a sort of a role-playing game session in the office. I don't think my staff are into that, so I haven't tried that. But if anybody wants to try that, come up with some games around these cards, I'd be really interested in finding out. But understanding that persona, we can actually uncover more information about the environment somebody's doing their job in. And that's really useful for ideas for our exploratory test session. So hopefully using this formula, you can go bust your own ghosts. Or really, you should actually stop burying the user in the first place and killing them so they become a ghost. So thank you for listening, and don't forget to rate the session. And we've got time for questions. Yeah, Lisa.
You mentioned that you might map something in advance and show it to developers. Is that the test cases or the actual personas and roles?
That's ideas for the test charter. So that's based off the I got this off Dan, sort of when the user story sort of first developed, actually sort of do a mind map of the ideas for your test charter or charters and identify the risks. So if we look at the personas and the job, we can get ideas for that. And if, say, we discovered with Leanne that she works remotely, we need to consider the security and we need to consider the connection quality and how the application responds to that. The developers would appreciate knowing that up front. Right at the back. Okay, so we don't have any sort of reporting like that. We certainly wouldn't report on persona. If we were doing any reporting, it would be based on job, because that's the actual functional element of the user story. Now, the way you measure the user experience, so how everything comes together, we actually measure how people use our product and active users. And obviously you can't do that so much in an internal system, because sometimes people are forced to use it, but actually measuring inside the product is the way we do it in production. Because we have no way of telling about issues unless we use that production data, because it gives us a lot of context. So our main metric is how much money has this bug cost us? What's the opportunity cost, or how much revenue is lost by losing customers? And that's really good in a product context. I haven't had to translate that into an internal team recently, so. Any other questions? Yeah. Yes, we don't use the template at all. We just write a sentence, because they're meant to be a placeholder for the discussion. I think partly it's electronic tools and index cards. We've got lazy at actually discussing them. So going back and actually using them as a placeholder, using free text, and when we take our notes, going back over them to try and identify people we should be talking about is quite important to us. I think, Lisa, you had a question?
You mentioned left shifting, and I don't know what that is.
Okay. So it's about getting the testers involved at the requirement stage or the user story stage.
Why is it left?
I don't know. I've borrowed the term. I don't normally use that term, to be honest. It's because if you've got testing on the right, you're shifting the time of testers from some of it from the right to the left. But I've got university textbooks from the early 90s that was saying that on requirements engineering, saying testers should be involved in requirements engineering. It's only recently people have started applying it. So, okay, more people applying it. Any other questions? So that's a really, really good point. As you start adding additional roles in, particularly if it's for achieving a particular job, the complexity goes up of the user story. But that also means your estimations go up, and then you look at splitting it. As long as you've recognized about that and you've split the user story, and you've made a choice on priorities of the user stories, that's fine. Yes. Yeah, we develop epics a lot. We do quite focus on a particular role and a job for our epics, and actually generate a lot of user stories out of that. Okay, well, hopefully you're all busting ghosts very soon. Thank you.